The radical theorem is this: the world is as perfect as it is honest. The radical theorem implies a direct correlation between the state of the world and its level of honesty. The radical theorem predicts as honesty increases, the world or group increasing in honesty will improve. Conversely, as the world descends into deceit and corrupt mental activities, it will worsen proportionately. It only takes 2 or 3 people to establish a culture of honesty, which means it only takes 2 or 3 persons to serve as a light, as a beacon to the world. The line between good and evil, and between heaven and hell, and indeed between perfecting, the perfect empire, and this world of sin and degradation, is 2 or 3 honest people. Honesty is justice in that if we were all honest, we would all be equal. There would be no injustice because all injustice is buttressed by lies. All lies serve to generate inequality and acts that presuppose an unequal relationship. To find the guilty is to find the liar. The liar does not speak the truth. He or she misrepresents the facts. The liar attempts to change reality. But if the world is created perfect, then to try and speak a different world into existence, as one does with lies, that world will be necessarily flawed. But there are different kinds of lies. There is the imperfect representation in which we talk about the world or elements of it that are not true representations of what is real. Then there is the altered perceptions, in which one actually attempts to create a perception of things which was never seen or experienced. Then there is the remodeling of reality, in which the liar attempts to restructure reality. Reality is composed of 2 components. There is the assets or the physical portion of reality. This component is what we can see, feel, smell, hear, and taste. This is phenomenological reality. However, there is also the part of reality humans create. This is the equity portion. Equity is not visible, but its impacts are. Equity is value added to assets by work. Equity creates what we see as society. The things of this world are not customized for our use. Most things need to be processed before they are suitable for use by us. This takes work, and since we all need to consume what the world provides, in a form that is created by human inputs, we all ought to work. To eat or to consume resources without creating a similar amount of labor is dishonest. Lies begin with the lies we tell ourselves. Truth begins with self-awareness. We need to take the beam out of our own eye so we can see our motivations. But the greatest lie we tell ourselves is about our value. This is why we need the church to keep us accountable. The binding together that we undergo as part of the church is the faith that develops through our accountability. We must, as believers, learn to trust one another. This is what Scripture is all about. However, to bind on earth requires honesty, and honesty requires justice. Justice results in equality. We must each pay our own costs, and no one is obliged to pay the cost of another. The world's greatest lie is that someone else owes us an inherent or inheritable debt. The root of honesty is the realization that no one owes us anything, right up to and including God. The reason for the faith we have, the core conception of apologetic, is the realization of the perfection it makes possible, the honesty faith imposes upon us. If we truly have faith in God, ultimately, we must trust His creation. Honesty generates equality. Only lies gives us a hierarchy. X+/X. One determines economic development and the rise and collapse of civilizations, where X is honesty. Economic development is entirely determined by the ratio between honesty and its lack. The radical dictum states we must each pay our own costs. We have no obligation to pay the cost of others. The radical dictum or principle provides the basis for the radical constitution. Everyone has an inalienable right to what they create, and no one has the right to unilaterally impose a claim on that which was produced by another. If it cannot be radicalized, that is, if a proposition cannot be taken to its logical conclusion, it cannot be true. To be radical is to be fundamental. Radicalism requires we go to the very root of the issues or problem and do away with liberal or shallow solutions. Radical perfectionists are Christians who embrace scripturalism in a radical way. Scripturalism is an epistemological and philosophical approach that treats sacred writings as the fundamental, axiomatic truth from which all other knowledge is deduced. It posits that the Bible as the ultimate foundation for understanding reality. Ultimately, Christians are attracted to Christianity and faith because Christianity is radical. Christian radicalism rejects secular philosophies and empirical explanations in favor of a radical scripturalism. What needs to be done is for each person to find ways of limiting his or her exposure to the lure of freedom, especially to the idea of gaining something for nothing, including the lure of social benefits. There needs to be a concerted effort to pay for everything we receive. Things such as government pensions are difficult to rid ourselves of, but there are other areas in which dependency is problematical. For example, the dependency of some on food banks. But no one can be perfected alone. Radicalization is not a private matter. For this reason, radical solutions are needed because finding a way to allow us to help one another towards justification will require radicalization. The radical solution requires we achieve control over ourselves. This is the meaning of taking the beam out of our own eye. We need to focus on the removal of our own faults and failings. Every advance, every movement ahead required change. All change is achieved by value being added to assets through work. This happened in two stages. The first is the classical or artisans period when all work was done by hand with little in the way of machines or organized productivity. England overcame a giant difficulty and surmounted insurmountable odds, emerging from the classical, small-scale manufacture to create the Industrial Revolution. What they overcame is the trust paradox. The trust paradox is the dilemma of whom to trust when the first person to trust another is made vulnerable. But trust is built on the basis of honesty. If everyone is dishonest, trust is impossible. Most researchers focus on the mechanical and organizational changes. What they ought to look at is the maturation of the British psyche. Britain achieved a high level of spiritual maturity. Spiritual maturity is founded on a high level of honesty. Britain became a nation of people who learned to trust one another, and with this trust came a willingness to expose themselves to risk. What is rarely understood is the mental leap it takes to go from thinking what one can do to improve one's own life, to thinking what changes in our thinking needs to be made to leap to the next stage. Instead of thinking about personal skills and scheduling, the British began to think about community, about thinking in terms of a system devoid of risk. It was a different type of thinking. Rather than being focused on personal limitations and abilities, the British began to think in terms of what is called risk management, or the recognition of risk, and how to minimize it. In other words, how to make it possible to trust one another. The solution was an economic system that ultimately became known as capitalism. It was hardly perfect, but it permitted the British to think beyond the individual. Under the classical system, economics was basically restricted to the household. The individual managed his own time and resources. He applied his assets in ways that gave him the best outcome within the time frame he was working with. The classical system was restricted by the abilities of one person, which gave rise to the journeyman/master system. We can refer to this as the advanced or authoritarian system, as it was a way to perfect the authoritarian system, which had been attacking the classical system through most of its history, but was frustrated by the disconnectedness of the classical elements, each being to some degree self-sufficient. By forcing the subject to use the king's coinage, the subjects were susceptible to being herded into the plants of the industrial age. Which brings us to radicalism. We are not radical unless we burrow down to the basics. The only solution to the mess we are in, needless to say, is the radical theorem. Everyone owns what they produce. We do not use an asset as a currency because this would introduce liabilities into the system. The only solution to poverty is for everyone to own what they produce without qualification. What we produce is produced through work. We own the value added to assets through work. But when someone uses an asset such as a fiat or bank account to impose a claim of our equity, we are being scammed. When someone prints paper money or creates a digital balance in a digital account and uses this to buy assets produced through work, it is a scam. Bank balances and fiat money is a liability imposed upon us as a currency. As soon as the government or bank creates credit, they have created a liability that society and future generations must pay. If fiat money exists or bank accounts and balances, then you are being robbed blind. The radical theorem is your only recourse.